Well, good morning to all of you and Eddie. If I was thinking this morning, if you're in a movie theater and it was this empty, you'd go home bragging because you'd be talking about how you had the whole place to yourself. Somehow it doesn't feel like the same thing when it's church. Kind of a little bit sadder. Anyways. Glad you're all here. God bless you all for making your way here on such a cold day. Yeah, as a pastor, one of my jobs for preaching is finding good sermon illustrations. I don't know if you've ever given a sermon, but illustrations are tough. You know, finding the right story to fit into your sermon that drives home the point, and it's not too distracting. It's entertaining, but not so entertaining that people forget your message. And I mean, it's a challenge. There are weeks when I'm preparing for a sermon, and I feel like I would pay someone $100 if they could give me the perfect illustration. And I know for me specifically, that's one of those things from week to week, it can be a challenge. But I know some preachers, and they're really good at this. That's one of the things they're gifted at. They can walk down the street, and in the time it takes them to go around the block, they could have half a dozen illustrations for their sermon. And they're just so good at observing and then applying it to biblical truths. One example is a man named Donald Barnhouse, who wrote this book, Let Me Illustrate. And this is the kind of guy who, he could go anywhere and find a good illustration. And so what happens is he goes around finding these illustrations, writing them down, so that pastors like me and preachers like me can spend hours going through these books trying to find the one that works for us. But today I actually want to talk about who I think was the master of illustrations. And of course, that would be Jesus. Jesus was so good at illustrating from the world around him. If you think about it, he could draw illustrations from anywhere. He'd be watching a guy, sowing seeds in his field, and he'd have an illustration that he could come up with about kingdom principles. Or he would go and you could see even simple things, like he could watch a bird fly across the sky and come up with an illustration about the birds of the airs. And that's the kind of thing that came so naturally to Jesus. And even so, one of the ways that really shows the mastery of Jesus' ability is he could take a story filled with wicked people doing absolutely wicked things, and he could find an illustration for how you should live a biblical kingdom lifestyle. And we're going to look at that story today in Luke chapter 16. And this parable, if you will, this illustration he's going to use, is often considered one of the most difficult parables in the whole of text, in the whole of the Bible. But it doesn't need to be that way. And we're going to study it today and find out how Jesus is able to make a great lesson from a really bad example. So if you have your Bibles, please open up to Luke chapter 16. And once you're there, starting in verse 1, I'd like you to stand as I read this out loud for us, if you're able. Starting in verse 1 of Luke chapter 16, this is what we read. He also said, that's Jesus, to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Turn in the accounts of your management, for you can no longer be manager. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me?
I am not strong enough to dig, and I am too ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So summoning his master's debtors, one by one, he said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. Then he said to another, 'How much do you owe?' He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill, and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings.'" Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Heavenly Lord, Father, as we enter into your word this morning, I pray that you would bring clarity to us for this message, for what you intend for us in our lives. You have a valuable lesson for each and every one of us. And you brought us here today so that you could grow us, even in ways that might be uncomfortable. And I just pray that your Holy Spirit would already be opening up our hearts to receive this word. Be preparing us for what we need to hear today. And God, I pray that you wouldn't let our stubbornness get in the way of us hearing this word for what you intend for us to do in our lives. God, you are a good God. You are a God of all wisdom and truth. We praise you in your holy name. Amen. You may have a seat. Yeah, scholars have a hard time with this parable. There might be more ink spilled over this parable for scholars than any other parable. And if you have a study Bible, it might say something very different than the person next to you about what this parable means. But this parable doesn't need to be confusing for us. It might look difficult at first, but I think if we follow a few simple principles, we can really unpack this and learn from it. First off, we need to remember something about parables. And I talked about this last week when we talked about the parables of the prodigal son, the lost coin, the lost sheep. When we talked about parables last week, if you remember, one thing I said that was really important is for us, when we're studying parables, we should not allegorize parables that Jesus doesn't allegorize. If he makes an allegory of a parable, if he doesn't make an allegory, we shouldn't. When he does, we should. So the example that I gave last week is the parable of the sower. In the parable of the sower, every little piece of the parable represented something. And so that's an example where he made the parable into an allegory, and then we were supposed to know what each part meant. When Jesus doesn't do that, we shouldn't do that. Parables are like fables. They are written to teach one main lesson, in which that one main lesson might have multiple applications, but they're supposed to be one main lesson. Why do I say that? Because I think a lot of times people don't understand this parable because they try to make it into an allegory. The second thing that often makes this parable difficult is that people don't take it at face value. A lot of scholars, to make themselves, I think, feel more comfortable with the subject matter, they will add details that Jesus didn't add. But what I want to assure you is everything that Jesus intended to include is included here. We can understand this parable without adding words into Jesus' mouth. And unfortunately, a lot of scholars, I think, go down a wrong route of adding things in that are unnecessary to try and explain away some of the hard parts of this parable. Last but not least, we need to take it slow. We need to unpack a few phrases that are more idioms. And you know what an idiom is. If I talk about, if I went to a, let's just say, for example, I went to a movie. At the end of the movie, I'm just like, wow, I am blown away. They really knocked that one out of the park. That's an idiom. It's a phrase we use in our language that we all understand the meaning of, but if you translated it literally into a foreign language, it would be very confusing. And so there's some idioms, if we take slow, we can actually understand, and it clears up a little bit of the misunderstanding here. So let's just start with verse 1, and we're just going to take this slow, go through, because there's a really important lesson buried in this for us. Starting with verse 1. He, which is Jesus, also said to his disciples, now pause here. We want to get the setting. Jesus had just finished giving the parables in the previous chapter. And when he was giving those parables, if you remember, he was giving those parables to the Pharisees and the scribes. Now, he had been hanging out with tax collectors and sinners. The Pharisees and scribes show up, and he gave them those 3 parables. Now he's going to turn it and address his disciples. But one thing you need to understand, and this is based on verse 14, the Pharisees didn't go away. They're still hanging out in the background. Jesus is addressing this to his disciples, but the Pharisees are still there. So he also said to his disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. Now, we can think of this rich businessman. He would have been very rich indeed if he had his own manager. In fact, if you think about it, most people, if they're wealthy, they typically manage most of the estates themselves. But this is the kind of rich man who's so rich that he wants to give away the administrative tasks to someone else. And I don't blame him. I hate administrative tasks. I mean, who likes paperwork? Anyone?
So, question though, is he telling a story?
This is the beginning of a parable.
But
A story that
made up story?
it's a made-up story. Yeah, parables
That's what I have
are
to
stories Jesus invented.
Okay. So this is not
To
you're not
prove a
telling
point.
story of something that really was happening.
Yes, exactly. Excellent question. Thank you. Parables, just like the parable of the prodigal son, the parable of the lost coin, parable of the sheep, these are made-up stories that didn't actually happen. So just like you can think of Aesop's fables, you know, and everyone here knows the story of the tortoise and the hare. Well, let me tell you, there was no actual tortoise and hare that story is based on. They were made up to tell a story and make a point. And that's the case here. So he's telling the story of a man, and this is a story Jesus invented, a rich man, so rich that he could hire a manager because he hated paperwork and didn't want to do the paperwork himself. He wanted an administrator who could handle all the runnings of the business so he could sit back and just collect the wealth, but not actually have to organize things. But this man he hired was doing his business in a way that is wasteful. And this is actually what keys us in that this is part of the same conversation as the previous chapter, because that word for wasting his possessions here, it's actually the same word that's used to describe the prodigal son in the previous parable who was wasting away his possessions that he had gotten from his father. So this manager was being wasteful, and the master found out about it from a reliable source. Verse 2. And so he, the rich man, called the manager and said to him, "What is this I hear about you? Turn in the accounts of your management, for you can no longer be manager." So we have the manager getting fired. And this normally, I think the wise thing would be fire him, get him off the premises. That's not what happens. Rather, he gets fired, and the rich man says, "Now I need you to turn in your accounts." You can imagine with the wealth of this man, there's quite a few pieces of paper to hand over, quite a few accounts to discuss, and quite a bit that this manager is going to need to account for. And therefore, it would give this manager a period of time to get this ready. And this period of time is exactly the opportunity the manager needs. Let's look at verse 3 as the manager realizes what's happening. Verse 3, the manager said to himself, this is an inner monologue. He knows he's getting fired. There's no chance he's saving his job. And so he goes and he gives this inner monologue to himself. What shall I do, since my master is taking away the management from me? This is typical problem solving if you think about it. You know, the first step in problem solving, state your problem. I'm losing my job. And in this day and age, you would live where you worked when you were working for a master like this. He would own the larger property that you were living at and working at. So this guy's not just losing his job, he's losing where he's going to live. So he states the problem. I'm losing this. Now he goes on to step two. Step two is what? You want to brainstorm. Come up with possible solutions. And so in his inner monologue, that's what happens next. Well, I'm not strong enough to dig. At least, you think he's going through this. He's probably thinking, maybe I could dig for a few hours, but 6 days a week, not a chance. I can't handle that. He goes on to the next possibility. Okay, well, I'm too ashamed to beg. And it's an interesting thing, that pride thing, isn't it? Because as we're about to see, he's too ashamed to beg, but apparently he's not too ashamed to steal. Verse 4, I have decided what to do. Now you don't really get the impact, I think, in the English translation that the Greek here has, but this is a eureka moment. It's a, oh, I know. It strikes him. I have decided what to do so that when I'm removed from management, people may receive me into their house. He gets this idea because he knows what he needs is he needs friends, but friends specifically who owe him. And what is that idea? He's going to show you in what he does next. Now, verse 5. So summoning his master's debtors, one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? Now you can almost imagine even the position of the debtor being called in here. Here you have a massive debt that you owe to someone. And all of a sudden you get a summons that their manager wants to see you. I feel like a knot would be already forming in your stomach. Like, okay, are they upset about a late payment? And maybe this debtor on his way to the master is thinking over maybe a prepared speech. I promise I'll pay you back. Just give me a little bit more time. And he's nervous. He wants to make a good impression. He has no idea what's going to happen. He walks through the door, and the manager's sitting there at his desk, as official as ever. So how much do you owe my master? Now, interestingly enough, this man knows how much he owes, and the manager even has a copy of the bill, so he knows how much he owes. But he asks this question, starts the conversation here. He says 100, verse 6, he said 100 measures of oil. This would have been equivalent to 875 gallons of oil. And this isn't Texas crude oil. This is olive tree oil. Do you have any idea how long it would take to knock olives off a tree and then squeeze them to make 1 gallon of oil? This is a substantial debt. 875 gallons would have taken a lot of time, a lot of manpower to obtain. So he says 100 measures of oil, 875 gallons of oil. And this is where he gets a shocking surprise. The manager says to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, write 50. He cuts his bill in half. You can even imagine the scene. He's sitting there, the man comes in and he says, here's your bill. This is the only copy of what you owe my master. Instead of it being 100 measures, let's call it 50. How would you feel if your credit card company called you out of the blue? Hey, Tom, we really like you. Would you mind if we cut your debt in half? I mean, you would be best friends with this credit card company. You'd be telling all your friends, you better go bank with this credit card company. Do your business through them. I mean, you can imagine, even for, say, young people going to college, what would happen if someone came along and promised to cut out their student debt? They might get elected president or something. This guy figures out how to make friends quickly. All right? And so he cuts the bill in half. The next guy comes in. The next person he owes him comes in. In verse 7, they said to another, how much do you owe? He said 100 measures of wheat. This is over 1,000 bushels of wheat. If you're a farmer, you know what that means. If you're not a farmer, it's a lot. And he says, take your bill, write 80. I want to cut 20% off that. Likewise, you can imagine this guy going, I like you quite a bit. If you ever need anything, let me know. Place to stay, whatever you need, let me know. This guy is making friends. And not just once or twice. This is an example, as you can see. He said, one by one, all of the debtors, one after another, each and every person who owed the master debt would be coming in, and this man would spend all day making friends. Why? Well, it seems to be the case that it's a good idea in his situation to have quite a few couches open to him if he has to crash for a night. Quite a few people who owe him. And mind you, and this is an honor culture, an honor-shame culture, and they have a lot at stake when it comes to when you do a favor for them, they owe you, and it's by honor that they will pay you back for what you've done for them. Now, mind you, this is not a good thing he's doing. He is literally stealing from his master and giving to these people who are the debtors. He is not being a good manager. He is being wicked here. Now, some people, they want to rescue the wicked manager because they don't like the idea that there are no heroes in this story. Because they want to allegorize it. They want to make one character the good guy so that we can say, oh, we should all be like him. And so oftentimes this is what bugs people enough that they decide to start adding things to the story. Because some scholars will try and say, well, he wasn't really cutting the bill in half, he was just cutting out his commission. And yet there's no sign of that here in the text. And there's no way that he would have a 50% commission on things like oil. That is incredibly high if that was his commission. So that people try and defend him saying he was really just cutting out his own commission, and that's not true. Or they'll say there was exorbitant interest built into the price and he was cutting that out. And there's also no sign of that, and candidly, if that's what Jesus had intended to show, he would have said so. His audience would not have assumed that information. Rather, we need to take this at face value. This is a wicked man who is deciding to steal from his master using his position to make friends so that when he's fired, he has friends to go stay with. And these people he's making deals with, they're not dumb. They're not clueless people. They realize, I'm sure, that what he's doing isn't exactly the master's wishes. Or if they don't realize it, they're so self-centered that they don't want to pry and figure out whether or not this is the master's wishes. They see a deal, they want to take it quickly while it's on the table. They're doing so out of their self-interest, out of a selfish, wicked desire themselves. Now, this is where the story takes a surprising turn. Verse 8. The master commended the dishonest manager. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. Now, this is where people really get confused. And I don't want us to blow this out of proportion. Why would he commend someone who has been stealing from him? That doesn't seem to make sense. And it seems shocking that he would do so. But I want to point out, this is not unreasonable. After all, the story doesn't say he forgave the steward, the manager. It doesn't say that they became friends or anything like that. Rather, he admired a quality he saw in the manager. And what was that quality? That quality wasn't the manager's dishonesty, it was his shrewdness. This is because the master was a man was a man of shrewdness. He was a man who knew how to play the games of the world, and when he recognized a clever maneuver on the part of this manager, he actually admired it. He thought to himself, wow, what a good move. This is someone who knows how to play the game well. And he admired what he saw, because I'm sure that's the exact kind of move he would have wanted to make. That doesn't make the two friends. I'm sure that the master, if the story had gone on, would still have sought revenge in some form or another. But he admired what he saw in this clever maneuver. The rest of the verse kind of shows you that, as it says, back looking at this same verse, in verse 8, it says, "For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light." Here comes some of the reason, some of the purpose behind this. There are people who play the game, clever people in this world who are shrewd with what they have. They're really good with money. They're really good with their possessions. And this is true today. We have all sorts of clever people in this world using their resources to outmaneuver one another, to get away with things that they shouldn't be getting away with. So much so that we have government agencies set up to try and stop those people. And then what happens? Those intelligent, smart people, they get lawyers to find the loopholes to keep doing what they want to do. That's how the world works. We live in a world of shrewdness where everyone is clever and seeking and going after the things of this world. They're wise in a sense, in the worldly sense. They're sharp people. They know how to avoid certain taxes. They know how to get themselves ahead of everyone else. And they spend a lot of time and energy making sure that they're one step ahead of everyone else. And they admire when they see a clever move. They admire when they see someone do something that they wish they had done. There's something about that lifestyle that can appreciate when they see it. And that's what happens between the master in the story and the manager. He doesn't compliment him. He doesn't commend him for his ethics. He commends him for his shrewdness. And it really shows you the master is a wicked person. This is a story full of wicked people doing wicked deeds. And yet there is a lesson to be learned for Christians. And there it is. The people of this world are shrewd, more so than in verse 8, than the sons of light. Jesus is talking about maybe one of the most embarrassing downfalls of Christians, of disciples of his, is often, you and I are called to be innocent as doves and wise as serpents. We often fall very short on the wisdom as serpents. We often walk into things blindly, trusting in things when we should be more shrewd. And specifically, he ties in the point to the next verse, verse 9, where he hammers home, what is it we're supposed to be doing? Because what we can recognize is Jesus is saying, we should be shrewd. But how? Verse 9. I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. Now, what's this mean? Let's go slowly. Just make friends for yourselves by unrighteous wealth. This is that idiom I was warning you about. All this is just referring to is worldly money, worldly possessions. The money of this world is unrighteous. It's the money of our times. And so what is Jesus saying? He's saying, I want you to be shrewd in this way. I want you to use the worldly money in your pockets to go make eternal investments in friends who will be with you in heaven. That's the story. That's the moral of the story where he lands. Jesus is saying, you need to be shrewd with your money, but not shrewd like the world is shrewd, going after earthly things. I want you to be shrewd in how you use your money to win friends for heaven. That's what this comes down to. This is a lesson about how well we manage our finances. And this is a lesson I think we might need repeated to us over and over again. Because there's a lesson to be had here. There's a type of money that will fail us, according to this verse, and that's the earthly money. When does money fail you? When you die. Consider this for a moment. If you've ever been to another country, and you try and go and purchase something with American dollars, most of the time, it won't work. I know this because when I went to South Africa, I had a layover in the UK, and we did a tour of the city, and I realized quickly on the tour of the city that I was going to go very hungry that day because all I had was American money, and no one would take it. And here's the point. American money is not the currency in that country, therefore it's useless. Our earthly money is not the currency in heaven. There's a story of a prospector who was out mining near the Mojave Desert in California. And he was out there mining when all of a sudden he struck what he thought was the mother lode. And he filled up 2 large sacks of gold. And he put it on his old burro, his old donkey, and they took off across the desert. But as he went, he began to run out of water. And the sun was getting hot. He had exerted himself getting this gold on the donkey. The donkey was exhausted carrying the weight of him and the gold. Well, eventually his donkey dies in the desert. And he tries to take the gold and drag it as far as he can go. Until finally he hits his end point. And there in the desert, as he's lying, dying, he pulls out a piece of paper, and what he writes down was, I died a rich man. Of course, people came and found his body and opened the sacks and discovered that what he had died carrying was iron pyrite. Fool's gold. It was a lie. The riches he thought he had died with were false. But let me tell you something. If those sacks had been full of real gold, they still would have been false riches. Do you think when he got to heaven, even if he could have taken the gold with him, that would have been the currency? Gold isn't currency in heaven, it's their asphalt. When he gets to heaven, or in his case, probably not heaven in the end, but the second he died, none of that riches mattered even a little bit. And yet we sometimes act like that's not going to be true of us. We spend our lives going around trying to collect the money of this world, trying to play the shrewd games of this world to collect a treasure we can't even take with us. There's an old famous saying, there are no U-Hauls behind hearses. You can't take it with you. So what is Jesus telling you? Here in this passage, what Jesus is telling you is you need to make investments now for your treasures in heaven. You need to exchange in your earthly currency for heavenly currency. And that happens before you die. Because once you get there, it's too late. That's what the lesson of this story is. Now, what investments are you to be making with your money? You are to invest in the only thing that will last. Making friends for eternity. Sharing the gospel. Because each person who hears the gospel message and is saved is someone you are going to get to hang out with forever if you are saved. You'll be closer to them someday in the future than you are to your spouse now. Every single person who is saved. What is Jesus telling us to do? We are to invest our money, our earthly money, here or now, into gospel ministry in some form or another. Now let me take a pause here. Because a lot of times when you get to churches, they get uncomfortable talking about money. And sometimes it's because there are some churches who do it the wrong way. There are a lot of churches, they start talking to you about money, and they go on this long spiel begging you and pleading you to give, as if God is going out of business. As if God is so helpless without your dollar. And what they do when they beg like that, it's practically blasphemous. The way they act as if God is so helpless and defenseless without your finances. And these churches, it's shameful. And it's not just churches, there's ministries who do it too. They shamefully will beg and plead for you to send all of your money to them. As if God can't handle things. And because of the way they abuse asking for money, and often, in those cases, they are often asking for money not for God's ministry, but really for themselves. But the way they abuse asking for money often makes other churches really uncomfortable with asking for any at all, and they'll be completely silent on the topic. Here, we don't have to worry about that. You know, Jesus, pretty much when you break down what he taught throughout his life in the Gospels, 1 out of every 5 things he had to say was about money. So we can't be afraid to talk about money. Because Jesus talks about money. But I'm not afraid to talk to you about money because ultimately, when we have the right perspective about money, I think it doesn't become this uncomfortable topic. You know, when I was in college, oftentimes I'd be really poor. And at times, I would need money for something, and I'd have to call my grandma, and I dreaded that. If you've ever had to ask someone for money, it can feel like the worst thing ever. And so it becomes uncomfortable. It becomes something you want to avoid. That's not the relationship we have here in this church. Because I'm not begging for your money. I know that God gives me my paycheck. And he might use you giving to this church to give me my paycheck, but ultimately, if you decided not to, he still would. He's a faithful God, and I trust that he is the one who pays for this church. And whether you want to give or not, if he wants this church to continue, it will continue. So, that being said, I don't have to beg this church to give money. And therefore, I can talk to you about your money candidly, because I'm talking to you about what are you investing for your spiritual future. That's what Jesus is talking about here, is how are you investing your money into your future? Why was that manager, that wicked manager, what did he do so well? He used his temporary position, his temporary power to secure his future. That's what Jesus is asking for each of us to do. Are we going to use what God has given us here and now, the temporary wealth, power, positions we have in this life to secure our future, to secure friends for heaven? So how do we do this? How do we do this? Well, there's a few ways we can go about this. First and foremost, we need to support gospel-centered mission work in some form or another. Maybe that is at a local church like this one. And when I tell you, if you find a church that you think is sharing the gospel better than this church, go support them instead. But we want to be shrewd with the money. Sometimes Christians, they will give to any organization that calls themselves Christian, no questions asked. That's not being shrewd with what God has given us. That's not being wise. we have been given a resource. We want to invest it in the people who are actually spreading the gospel, actually making a difference, actually reaching hearts and souls. And so you want to find a local church that you want to support who is doing those things so that you can be a part of it. So that when they win people over to Christ, they will be friends of yours in heaven. They will be a part of your account when God asks you to show what you have to account for with the wealth he gave you. Not just local churches, though. Maybe there's a seminary that you think is making godly leaders that you want to support. Maybe there are seminary students that you could support and help them get to that place where they can go out and share the gospel like they should. Maybe it's missionaries, specific missionaries. But once again, just because someone says they're a missionary, that doesn't give you license to just throw any amount of money away at them. You need to be shrewd. What's that mean? Examine. Well, what do you really believe? How are you going to share the gospel? How are you going to reach these people? Because a lot of missionary organizations are only interested in humanitarian efforts that have no kingdom impact. You want to be shrewd because you want to make sure that what you're supporting is actually supporting the gospel, actually supporting the salvation of lost souls. That's what you should be spending your money on. But don't just do it that way. You can do this individually too. How can you be shrewd individually investing your money? By finding friends you can sit down with. Say, hey, let me take you out and buy you a cup of coffee. You can invest your money in buying people coffee to share with them the gospel, to talk about deep things in life with them. If you have a friend in need and you come and meet their need and show them Jesus' love, that's an opportunity for you to invest in making a friend for eternity. You can use your money in your life here and today to invest in making friends for eternity. That's what we're called to do, and you're called to be shrewd with it. Don't be careless with your resource. That's what this passage says. Just because someone says they're a Christian, don't believe everything they say and throw your support behind it. Examine who you're supporting and make sure that your support is going to where it's needed, because it makes a difference, because lives are at stake. Now, some of you, whenever someone talks about money, you might have a pre-built up defense in your head. Well, I would love to do that, Pastor Josh, but I just don't have enough. If I had more, I would give more. And that's not true. You say, how would I know that? I don't know your personal finances, and that's true. I don't know your personal finances. I don't know any of that. What I know is what Jesus says. And Jesus says it has nothing to do with your finances, but your character. Look at the next verse. One who is faithful with very little is also faithful in much. One who is dishonest in very little is dishonest in much. You say you would give more if you had more, and that's not true. How much you have doesn't have anything to do with your character. If you are someone who is generous, and you have a generous character, you are generous with the little you have, and therefore if you had more, you would be generous with more. If you're not being generous with what little you have now, you would not be more generous if you won the lottery, if you got that raise or promotion. That's not going to change. It's about your character. It's about your priorities. Jesus says, do not lay up treasures for yourselves on earth, where thieves break in and steal, where moths and rust destroy. Lay up your treasures in heaven, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And you can reverse that. Think about this. Where your heart is, there your treasure will be also. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It goes either way. So what I'm trying to tell you is, if your heart is on heavenly things, you're going to be investing your money in heavenly pursuits rather than worldly pursuits. If what you treasure is in heaven, you are going to be using your money for that. If the thing you treasure is here on this earth, that's why it's so hard for you to give, because your treasure is in the wrong place. What you love is in the wrong place. Don't pretend that just because if you got more money you would give more, everything would change. That's just not true. And it says, if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, once again it's that idiom, the worldly wealth, who will entrust you with true riches? Think about this. And this is, actually, let me add in the next verse, because these two go together. If you have not been faithful in that which is another, who will give you that which is your own? What's Jesus' point here? It's simple. All of your wealth here and now, your earthly wealth, that's not your wealth. Plain and simple. You are a steward of God. That wealth is God's gift to you. Your resources are not your own. They belong to God. Some Christians, they talk as if, I have to give 10% of my paycheck to God, as if God is supposed to own 10% of your paycheck. That's not true. God owns all of your paycheck. How much are you keeping for yourself? Everything God gave you, you are a steward of. Your money is not your own. You are a steward of that money for God. You are a manager of that money for God. And if God can't trust what He's handed you to manage here and now, why will He trust you with true riches later? Now, what's this really getting to? This is very much hinting at heavenly treasures. Treasures for after this life. If you're not faithful in what He's handed you here now on this earth, why should He give you heavenly treasures? And it's not just your treasures. It's not just your money, in fact. It's also your time. You are a steward over your time in the same way. That time that you have, that's not your own. Your time belongs to God. How are you using your time? Are you using your time for heavenly things here? Are you using your time here well? And let me tell you, I believe there's going to be jobs in heaven. Work came before the fall. God gave Adam a job before the fall. Work is a good thing. Work is something that God has given to us, something that we can do in a satisfying way that we can take pleasure in. And I believe in heaven we will have jobs. Jobs in which we can participate in all eternity. Now consider this. What job is God going to give you there if you're unfaithful with the job He's giving you here? Right now, how you spend your time, how you spend your money, this is part of your resume for your heavenly position. Right now, you are working on your resume for your heavenly job. You know what? The problem with that resume, you can't lie on it. And there's no references that are going to help you out. God can't call up your buddy, and because He really likes your buddy, give you a position you don't deserve. What are you doing with what God has given you here and now? I'm warning you because I don't want any of you living in a shack in heaven, sweeping up the golden streets and whatnot. I don't know what God's going to give you, but my point is you can't blame me for not telling you. That's what Jesus really wants to get at. He ends with this. No servant can serve two masters, for he'll either hate one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't serve God and money. This is the bottom line. And as you think about that phrase, I think part of me, is questioning, you can't serve two masters? I feel like that could be possible. I mean, maybe, just maybe, if like we're just playing pretend here, but if me and Tom were like back in the day of slavery and we're like, man, we both want a slave, we can't really afford one each for our own, can't we buy a good slave together? We'll go into business together and we get the best slave there is. Julio. He's a hard worker, smart man, and then And maybe we split up a schedule where Tom would get Julio in the mornings and I could get him in the evenings, and it was a win-win scenario. Each of us would feed him a meal, and there'd be a shared shack on our property line that he could live in. And, maybe a slave could serve two masters, right? Well, that only would work if Tom and I were just in sync with everything. Because as soon as one of us gave him an instruction that the other didn't agree with, what's Julio to do? It doesn't work. And so it's really not about the nature of slavery that makes it impossible to serve two masters. It's the nature of the masters that makes it impossible. And you cannot serve God as your master and money as your master. They want opposite things for you. They want different things for you, and they make it impossible to serve them both. Think about it. What does money tell you to do? It tells you to take. It tells you to hoard. It tells you to trust in yourself. What's God command you to do? He commands you to give. He commands you to love. He commands you to trust in Him. These two masters could not want more opposite things for your life. If you've been pursuing money and earthly possessions, you can't pursue God. If you pursue Him, you can't also pursue the money of this world. It doesn't work. That's Jesus' point. When Pompeii was being excavated, there was a body found that had been embalmed in the ashes of Vesuvius when it had erupted. And this body was of a woman, and her feet were turned toward the city gate, but her face was turned backwards towards something that lay just beyond her outstretched hands. The prize for which those frozen fingers were reaching for was a bag of pearls. Now we don't know, was this the woman's bag and she dropped it, and rather than continuing to run, she turned to go back for it? Was it just a bag of pearls lying there? She saw her opportunity, it was dropped by someone else, and she wanted it. I don't know which it was. But here's what I can tell you. Death is coming for all of us, as it came for her. Now, we can try and spend our time remaining doing everything we can to grab on and latch a hold of the unrighteous wealth that we can't take with us, that'll die here with us. Well, that when we die, it'll stay here and get spent by someone else. We can spend our next time pursuing those things. Or we can follow the shrewd manager's example and think about our futures. We can invest in our futures by using what God has given us to make investments with eternal value and sharing the gospel with others. Let's close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for gathering us together here today. I know we are missing many from our congregation who would otherwise be here, but your word does not go out void. And I know that someone here today, maybe many of us here today, needed to hear this story from your word, because we know there's a day when the books are going to be opened and we're going to have to give an account of how we've lived our lives. I pray that we take the warning from this passage, and that with the time we have remaining, we invest our lives wisely, and that your Holy Spirit would guide us, giving us that wisdom we need, showing us how we can make an impact for all eternity in the lives of others. You are a good God, a loving God. We praise you. We praise your holy name. We fall down at your feet, overwhelmed by the ocean of your grace. And we follow you with our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. Would you all please stand? I'd like to